Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Belgian presidency for initiating this event and giving me the opportunity to address you today. My main message is that nothing of what we discuss here will happen unless we have political attention and political leadership. And today, political attention and political leadership are fading, or maybe have faded. So a huge thank you to the Belgian presidency for your effort to put pandemics and pandemic preparedness back on the political agenda. And thank you, Gundo, for saying how important it is that we try and reach an agreement within the next few days, although, as Marianne alluded to, as we speak, this is still very uncertain. So I'll be giving a few remarks around this theme in my capacity as a former member of the independent panel on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. Okay, how does this work? Okay, sorry, thank you. That was convened by the World Health Assembly in November 2020 and provided its report to the 74th WHA in May 2021. Followed by a number of scientific publications providing the evidence behind our recommendations, and followed also by a number of updated reports in 2022, 2023, and there's one to come in a few weeks. Now, the findings of the panel were unambiguous, and I agree with you, Yazdan, that we're all tired, if not fed up, with these messages. But I think that is the problem. It is the problem now. If we do not keep that on the agenda, then we will enter again this cycle of panic and neglect. Despite the warnings, yes, and despite the past lessons, the world was not prepared. Despite the warnings, lessons were not learned. As we analyzed the post-Ebola recommendations, less than 10% of those recommendations had been implemented between 2016 and December 29, when the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 occurred in China. And it was very clear across the world, including in Europe, that pandemic preparedness had received far insufficient political priority, and funding was vastly underfunded. So most countries failed to sustain the response in the face of the crisis of COVID-19, and the international system was too slow to generate the rapid response we needed, and failed to prevent, contain, mitigate the impact of the pandemic. National health systems, as you all know, have been under massive stress during the pandemic. Lack of planning, preparedness, gaps in social protection resulted in the pandemic widening inequities within and between countries. And those vulnerabilities in health systems had profound implications for health, economy, trust in government, and social cohesion. And the pandemic was also a huge economic loss. IMF's outlook estimated a 14 trillion cumulative global loss from the pandemic throughout 2024. And as you can see on this slide, with a disproportionate impact on developing countries and emerging middle-income countries with deeper and longer-lasting economic setbacks, which again tells us that a pandemic is not just a health sector event. Despite the warnings and despite the past lessons, we all know, and previous speakers alluded to that the world was not prepared in terms of delivering medical countermeasures. Neither national nor our international system managed to meet the initial demands in obtaining basic protection and medical supplies, and stark inequalities have left large parts of the world exposed to COVID-19. And that lack of equity in access to vaccines had at least 4 reasons that we have to keep in mind. One is the early saturation of manufacturing capacity. Another is the concentration of the manufacturing capacity of clinical trials, of knowledge generation for vaccines in only a small number of countries. Third was vaccine nationalism, buying it all from the beginning. And fourth, and still there, private sector control over intellectual property rights and industrial capabilities. So the panel came in 2021 with a package of evidence-based recommendations that were ambitious and practical, and the goal of these recommendations was to implement transformational change that would make COVID-19 the last pandemic of that devastation. I'd like to emphasize here 2 words. One is a package of reforms. Yes, they all have to come together. And the second is transformational change, which I just mentioned. Not small, step-by-step, here or there reforms. And these reforms can go into sort of 7 broad categories. One is sustained high-level political attention and leadership, which we don't see. Second, an effective surveillance and alert systems, or more effective surveillance and alert systems. 3, a new platform for equitable access to pandemic countermeasures and supplies. 4, sustained finance for preparedness and rapid access to surge financing in case a pandemic occurs. Investing in national preparedness. A strong, independent, and authoritative WHO, and accountability for preparedness and response. And as I'm saying here on the bottom of the slide, the panel did not recommend that all of that is managed through the pandemic accord necessarily. Now, there's been some progress made, as you know, in improved surveillance, establishment of the Berlin hub of collaborative surveillance, and a number of regional initiatives. We already heard some of them. For WHO, I believe an important step, and that was part of our recommendations, was a commitment of member states to increase unearmarked contributions to WHO. They should reach at least 50% of the budget of WHO by 2028 or 2029. And there was a pandemic fund created. However, as you can see on this slide, of which the EC-EU was a large, if not the largest contributor at this time. But as you can see here, contributions amounted to $1.7 billion, commitments were $350 million so far, and disbursements $100 million. So we're going very slow, and we're very far from the estimated 10 to 15 billion per year that both our panel and the G20 high-level financial group had estimated as the amount needed to fund preparedness and prevention of pandemics. There's been, in addition to those global initiatives, a number of regional initiatives. We discussed already some of what happened in Europe, as we heard Gundo's presentation, and you're all aware that Africa has really come together in times of COVID with a comprehensive planning for regional resilience. But if you look at the picture overall, the progress has been very slow, and certainly we're very far from any substantive transformational change to the international pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response system. And the red flags are political leadership, One Health, accountability, sustained finance, equitable access. In terms of financing, as I said earlier, the estimate is 10 to 15 billion per year, which of course is peanuts, yes, from a global perspective. We as a panel also thought that we should not try and have this amount of money in a conventional donor to recipient bilateral or multilateral international aid from north to south, because health security is in the mutual interests of all, and therefore we suggested that all countries of the world, whatever they are, contribute on an ability to pay basis somehow, which is not the model that the pandemic fund has taken. We also think that contributions from countries, from donor countries, should not come from their ODA budgets and not divert funds from other health and development priorities. Now, so far, as I said, 2 billion pledged to the pandemic fund and no clear future to the pandemic fund as we speak. On countermeasures, the panel has worked and publicized a number of recommendations, and Els Torelle, who is sitting here in the audience, has certainly been a scientist who's led us in this work. And what we have been recommending is regional resilience. And it's actually, the aim is, as she said in a question she was asking someone, I think you, Marian, the aim is to stop outbreaks where and when they occur. So to pre-position in every part, in every region of the world, and somewhere in some regions at sub-regional level as well, pre-position platforms. Platforms not only of manufacturing, because what's the point to manufacture a vaccine in Africa if the intellectual property is in the north? But pre-positioned platforms of research and development and manufacturing, and strengthening at the same time, as Yazdan pointed out, the regulatory components and the clinical trial components, and have these clinical trials not led by a market dynamic, but led by a public health interest. And I can see, and pre-positioning these platforms could, for example, be, in case of vaccines, a site having the mRNA technology, the adenovirus technology, and the ability to produce inactivated viruses, and then have a freedom to operate that whenever an outbreak occurs, they would regionally or sub-regionally immediately insert the gene and produce what is needed to stop that outbreak when and where it occurs again. If you look at where we are and progress along these lines, actually this is one of the weakest points in the current discussions in the international negotiating board in Geneva. So there's, at this time, nothing concrete that really came out of these discussions. No end-to-end, as we call it, platform for vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And if you look at the news, you know, this big company opening a manufacturing capacity in this or that part of Africa, it means that we remain largely in a sort of north-south rather than in the global solidarity logic. So coming to the another important point is the accountability. Because accountability and independent monitoring of a pandemic treaty is something that is non-negotiable. This is based on solid evidence from other treaties, as well as the history we have of inadequate compliance with the international health regulations. So for a threat that may center on health, but as we saw with COVID-19, relies on coordination with multiple sectors, independent monitoring is indispensable, and it requires a huge political coming together and a huge political investments. At this time, the only thing we know is that there will be a COP, a conference of the parties, like what happens in climate change, and that the first COP in 1 year time from now will actually discuss a coordinated financial mechanism of which the details and the details of governance are actually absolutely unknown. So we've entered now discussions on political attention and leadership. We had 3 recommendations from our panel. One is that there is a General Assembly, a special session, as we had in HIV in 2000, as we had for Ebola, as we had also for NCDs and for universal health coverage. That session took place in October 2023, 3 years after the beginning of the pandemic. And the outcome political declaration is really not transformative. We suggested a pandemic framework agreement, convention, treaty, and let's remember that this originally was proposed by the European Union, led by the European Council. And we also proposed a sort of global health threats council, if you wish, a security council for health at very high level of heads of state and government. We wouldn't go for an annex to the Security Council because the way the Security Council with the veto works with the veto system would not be appropriate. But that is something that did not come up of the political declaration of the special session of the General Assembly, and I believe that was a missed opportunity. So we're currently at the end of the negotiations of the pandemic accord. There are 4 core issues that are really at the heart of it and very difficult. Access to pathogens and benefits sharing, as already mentioned, medical countermeasures, including intellectual property, R&D, technology transfer and conditions behind technology transfer, financing, and then equitable delivery. The positive thing is that throughout the discussions, the focus, and in every speech of every country and every delegate, we heard about health, belief in equity as a guiding norm. But then it became evident after 2 years of negotiation that the draft, with numerous iterations, with 30+ provisions dealing with surveillance, response, research and development, production, technology transfer, pathogen access, compliance, financing, governance, needed additional time to negotiate carefully, because every of these single provisions were contested. And the lack of consensus that we see in Geneva also reveals a contested balance of power. The balance of power in the multilateral negotiations have been defined not only by Brazil, China, and India, whom you may remember were the skeptical around the pandemic accord in the beginning, but also by the 54-member Africa group and a host of other nations in Asia and Latin America. Having lived through the acute crisis of COVID-19 and the inequitable access to medical products during COVID-19, most developing countries have so far refused in these negotiations to accept status quo arrangements that have underscored the paradigms in the international response to the pandemic today. So they want and they ask for a change in paradigm, again, a transformative change. We are May 14 today. Yesterday, I sent my slides, and I was at 7:30 p.m., and it was still unclear at that time whether the discussions had stopped or not. Yesterday at 9:30 p.m., we learned that the negotiations will reconvene between 20 and 24 of May for 3 days or 4 days, that the text negotiated so far will be sent to the World Health Assembly with the yellow, green, and white underlining. Green means agreed, yellow means contested, white means we haven't time to work on it, and the World Health Assembly later this month will endorse how these discussions can proceed. There's also the discussion of knowing how that uncertainty around the outcome of the INB negotiations will impact the international health regulations discussions that are supposed to take place tomorrow or the day after tomorrow on 16 and 17. There is no plan B. There is no plan to extend beyond the World Health Assembly. That is clear, people have said. No plan to extend or to hold a special additional session. So the process going forward, I think, and I hope very much that an agreement will be reached to set up a basis, but the process going forward will likely be a transition to an open-ended working group system with a new team to take the process for the last mile. But that will take us with more time. So let's not wait. And regardless, work needs to be underway now, and we've heard about what's going on. We need the preparedness, we need surge finance plan, we need end-to-end platforms with regional resilience as a key objective, and we need accountability. Could that be decided by the COP, or should that go to the summit of the future, convened by the Secretary General next September, or should that go to a special next session of the UN General Assembly in 2026? Is not known. But again, as I said from the beginning, political leadership and the risk of political negligence of pandemic threats is the main concern. So if I think of this, and that is my last slide, common declarations of European leaders in 2020 calling for concerted action, high-level political action, I would really ask the question and leave it there with you. Can Europe bring back this spirit again? Thank you.
would you like to ask a question?
Good afternoon. Dimitri Einikel, Médecins Sans Frontières Access Campaign. Thank you so much for your presentation. I very much agree with most of what has been said. I actually have two questions, because you mentioned the transformative approach with regards to equity to medical products and the platforms that need to be established. In a way, the mRNA hub in South Africa and the different spokes and hubs around the world, kind of resemble that model. So my first question would be, to what extent do you see, or what prospects do you see for this particular hub, this model, etc., going forward, as it's being challenged as well by some of these initiatives by private companies? And then the second question is, considering there's so many policymakers in the room, from the EU, from the Commission, and also hearing about Horizon Europe funding, etc., what is, besides the pandemic treaty negotiations, what advice would you give to them in terms of, having a transformative approach going forward to increase equity to medical products?
Well, first, on the first part of the question, I certainly think that the hub model initiated in South Africa, in Cape Town, which is, by the way, a private-public partnership, and the other hubs, and that was funded by the European Commission at the start, is an extremely attractive model to follow. So no doubt on this, and I hope that this network will grow. And one of the important elements of that network is that each technological advance that is made in one of the hubs is shared with the others in a network that doesn't go back, somewhere to the north as a deciding power. So that is the model. The problem is that the future of this model is uncertain, and the push from industry, let's be clear, is there. So South Africa is also facing an offer from one of the major vaccine companies to have a vaccine factory, manufacturing capacity, built and operate within a few months, which would really be very competitive and somehow at least partly ruin the model. So we are in this hard world of competition, and I think that the only way to move out of this is to have a public health understanding of the issues and an agreement that would leave what else has been calling a freedom to operate, to those initiatives such as the hubs. And so that it has to deal with intellectual property. And we have to address that. It was not addressed in the negotiations, or it was a red line, and it was a red line for the European Commission. So that's not the way we can, move forward. And so I hope that these hubs will grow, will show that they are independently capable of producing new vaccines. And I recently heard one of the African leaders, actually the head of the African CDC, tell us that they're focusing now on continental R&D and production and manufacturing of vaccines for their viruses, for Marburg, for Ebola. And so they're not jumping into a competition with the Pfizers and the Modernas of this world, They're focusing on stopping outbreaks and epidemics where they are and when they occur, which I think is the reasonable way to go, and I think Europe and others should support those efforts as much as they can. And I've forgotten the second question. But, okay.
On Horizon Europe, research and development funding.
On Horizon?
Horizon Europe, the research and development programs of the European Commission and the European Union.
Well, think that the problem of Horizon, but I would rather leave Yazdan answer that question, is that it is very rigid in the way it's constructed. And we saw that rigidity in the beginning of in the early days of the pandemic. So we need much more agile systems. And with regard to cooperation with developing with low and middle income countries, we need their voice. We need them to be present. We need the decision-making process to be inclusive, which is not the case at this time.
You talked about shifting from competitive to a public health view on things. In your 4 points, the first point was pathogen sharing. And as you may be aware, Cambodia has decided that human pathogens should be considered as human material and therefore taken out of a lot of the constraints regarding pathogen sharing. Do you think that there are ways that that type of public health motivated policy change can be rolled out?
Well, there must be ways, but in 2 years of negotiations, the INB didn't find a way, although, again, people are saying in Geneva, or were saying yesterday evening, that we're not very far from an agreement. But as I think, Marion, you said, that part is more about will the benefits be 10% or 15% or 20% of vaccine shared with the developing world in case, or the region that initiated the pathogen sharing, which is not, to me, the important part. The important part is the upstream part. It is what you're saying. It is, we have public health is a global common good. And therefore, it is natural that pathogens are shared for the good of the common knowledge. The problem is that the current market system is making that global common knowledge a biased private property. Yeah? To make, making it very short, of course, it's much more complex, but that's what it is. And so unless we find public health approaches that are common good oriented, we will not solve these issues. And that's why the PABS negotiations, because they're not ambitious enough. Yeah, it's negotiating 18%, 20%, 22%. Yeah, that will not solve the question.
Perhaps one last question.
Hi, hello. Andrea Zanaglio. I'm heading EU Government Affairs for Gilead Sciences here in Brussels. I just wanted to say, you mentioned political commitment, investment, and prioritization. Definitely those are key areas, and I totally agree that are lacking in pandemic preparedness nowadays. And I wanted to build on my neighbor's question earlier, when we heard that we need to learn from old pandemics as well. And like in the case of HIV, where there has been enormous progress made. However, I think we also we don't have to make the mistake to think that, for instance, if I take HIV, it's not over. It's still a public health threat, including in Europe. Cases arises, especially in some vulnerable key populations. So, and Europe is not there yet in reaching the goals that we have set with UNAIDS, for instance. So my thing, I would like to have, knowing that you've been involved in the HIV pandemic, we had the Spanish presidency of the Council putting HIV on the agenda. We still have a very important political commitment coming up, with the European elections, new European Commission, still a couple of months of the Belgian presidency. So I would like to have your thoughts. How can we make sure that we don't forget pandemics that are it's dealt with, we don't need to do anything about it, but they're still a threat, and there is a real opportunity to end them as a public health threat?
Yeah, thank you. I think Europe has two challenges with HIV, and as I think you mentioned, I come from the HIV world myself. One is that the incidence of HIV among key populations has basically not decreased. It has decreased by 45% globally, but if you look at Europe, there has been zero progress in the last 10 years. Yeah? Some progress here, some decrease elsewhere. And the second challenge, and that is not really a public health threat, but it is that there are currently 30 million people on treatment, and we will have to continue treating these people in the coming years. So there is a sustainability challenge. Yeah? So that's where the problems are. But then if I relate HIV to the current pandemic, I'd like to say that why was HIV a success? Yeah? Because it is, yes, a public health threat for some populations in some places. It's not the global public health threat that Kofi Annan was mentioning in 2000 at the General Assembly of the UN. Why the success? Because of leadership. Kofi Annan, Mandela, President Bush, President Chirac, you name it. Yeah? Leadership. And leaders in COVID-19? Remember, 3 years ago, heads of state were calling each other every month. There wasn't a single European Council where health would not be the first item on the agenda. This has disappeared. Yeah? So leadership. Second, finance. The world came together to create a global fund, and PEPFAR, which is a sort of pandemic fund, contributed to the global fund. An effective multilateralism, where everyone came together around the table. No effective multilateralism around COVID-19, and possibly a failure of reaching a pandemic agreement. Yeah? An inclusive approach with the civil society. Where is the civil society in COVID-19 and pandemic preparedness? I don't see much of it. Thank you to MSF for your comment and what you do. And then, of course, the science, that everyone was believing it and everyone was accepting everywhere. And in COVID-19, there was no trust. We lost trust in science, and we had vaccine hesitancy, and that was hugely political, hugely political. There's a lot of evidence that in the US, districts that had voted Trump had much more vaccine hesitancy and higher rates of mortality and morbidity from COVID-19. So leadership, finance, effective multilateralism, trust in science, and accountability. The 5 ingredients of success that were present in HIV that haven't been present in COVID-19. So it's time to put them back on stage.